looking for a hoss before sunup and seen our camp, and went back and told their guide, and he sent him over to tell us to get out." "I'm worried about Joe," said old man Richardson. "He ain't come back." "I'll go look for him," I said. "I'll also scout their camp, and if the odds ain't more'n 10-1, we don't wait for them to attack. We goes over and wipes them out pronto. Then we hangs their fool sculps on our wagon bows as a warning to other such scoundrels." Old man Richardson turned pale and his knees knocked together, but I told him sternly to get to work swinging them wagons, and clumb on to Captain Kidd and lit out. Reason I hadn't saw the smoke of the Illinois camp was on account of a thick timbered ridge which lay east of our camp. I swung round the south end of that ridge and headed east, and I'd gone maybe a mile and a half when I saw a man riding toward me. When he seen me he come lickety split, and I could see the sun shining on his Winchester barrel. I cocked my 45-90 and rode toward him, and we met in the middle of an open flat. And suddenly we both lowered our weapons and pulled up, breast abreast, glaring at each other. "Breckenridge Elkins," says he. "Cousin Bearfield Buckner," says I. "Air you the man which sent that unlicked cub of a George Warren to bring me a defiance?" "Who else?" he snarled. He always had an awful temper. "Well," I says, "this here is our valley. You all got to move on." "What you mean, move on?" he yelled. "I brung them poor critters all the way from Dodge City, Kansas, where I encountered 'em being tormented by some wuthless buffalo hunters, which is no longer in the land of the living. I've led them through fire, flood, hostile Injuns, and white renegades. I promised to lead 'em into a land of milk and honey, and I been firm with 'em, even when they weakened their selves, even when they begged on bended knee to be allowed to go back to Illinois. I wouldn't hear of it, because, as I told 'em, I knowed what was best for 'em. I had this canyon in mind all the time, and now you tells me to move on." Cousin Bearfield rolled an eye and spit on his hand. I just waited. "What sort of reply does you make to my request to go on and leave us in peace?" he goes on. "George Warren come back to camp wearing his hat brim around his neck and standing up in the stirrups because he was too sore to set in the saddle. So I set 'em fortifying the camp whilst I went forth to reconnoiter. That word I sent you I now repeats in person. You're my blood kin, but principles come first." "Me too," I said. "A Nevada Elkin's principles is as lofty as a Texas Buckner's any day. I whooped you a year ago in Cougar Paw." "That's a cussed lie," gnashed he. "You taking a base advantage and land me with an oak log when I warn't expecting it." "Be that as it may," says I, ignoring the fact that you had just beamed me with a rock the size of a water bucket, "the only way to settle this dispute is to fight it out like gents. But we got to determine what weapons to use. The matter's too deep for fists." "I'd prefer butcher knives in a dark room," says he. "Only they ain't no room. If we'd just had a couple of sawed-off shotguns or good double-bitted axes. I tell you, Breck, let's tie our left hands together and work on each other with our buoys." "Nah," I says, "I got a better idea. We'll back our hosses together, then ride for the opposite sides of the flat. When we get there we'll wheel and charge back, shooting at each other with our Winchesters. Time they're empty, we'll be close enough to use our pistols, and when we've emptied them, we'll be close enough to finish the fight with our buoys." "Good idea," agreed Bearfield. "You always was a brainy, cultured sort of lobo, if you wasn't so damn stubborn. Now me, I'm reasonable. When I'm wrong, I admit it." "You ain't never admitted it so far," says I. "I ain't never been wrong yet," he roared, "and I'll carve the gizzard of the buzzard which says I am. Come on, let's get going." So we started to gallop to the opposite sides of the flat when I heard a voice hollering, "Mr. Elkins! Mr. Elkins!" "Hold on," I says. "That's Joe Richardson." Next minute Joe come tearing out of the bresh from the south on a mustang I hadn't never seen before, with a Mexican saddle and bridle on. He didn't have no hat nor shirt, and his back was crisscrossed with bloody streaks. He likewise had a cut in his skull which dribbled blood down his face. "Mexicans!" he panted. "I got separated from Ned and rode further'n I should ought to had. About 5 miles down the canyon I run into a big gang of Mexicans, about 30 of 'em. One was that fella Gomez. Their leader was a big feller they called Zamora. They grabbed me and taken my hoss and whooped me with their quirts. Zamora said they was going to wipe out every white man in the canyon. He said his scouts had brung him news of our camp and another east of ourn, and he aimed to destroy both of 'em at one sweep. Then they all got onto their horses and headed north, except one man which I believe they left there to kill me before he follered them. He hit me with his 6-shooter and knocked me down, then put up his gun and started to cut my throat with his knife. But I wasn't unconscious like he thought, so I grabbed his gun and knocked him down with it, and jumped on his hoss and lit out. As I made for camp, I heard you and this gent talking loud to each other and headed this way." "Which camp was they going for first?" I demanded. "I don't know," he said. "They talked mostly in Spanish I can't understand." "The duel'll have to wait," I says. "I'm heading for our camp." "And me for mine," says Bearfield. "Listen, let's decide it this way. The one that scuppers the most greasers wins, and the other'n takes his crowd and pulls out." "Bueno," I says, and headed for camp. The trees was dense. Them bandits could have passed either to the west or the east of us without us seeing 'em. I quickly left Joe, and about a quarter mile further on I heard a sudden burst of firing and screaming, and then silence. A bit later I bust out of the trees into sight of the camp, and I cussed earnestly. Instead of being drawed up in a circle, with the men shooting from between the wheels and holding them bandits off like I expected, them durned wagons was strung out like they was heading back north. The hosses was cut loose from some of 'em, and the mules was laying across the poles of others, shot full of lead. Women was screaming and kids was squalling, and I seen young Jack Richardson laying face down in the ashes of the campfire with his head in a puddle of blood. Old man Richardson come limping toward me with tears running down his face. "Mexicans," he blubbered. "They hit us like a hurricane just a little while ago. They shot Jack down like he was a dog. 3 or 4 of the other boys has got knife slashes or bullet marks or bruises from loaded quirt ends. As they rolled off, they yelled they'd come back and kill us all." "Why didn't you throw them wagons round like I told you?" I roared. "We didn't want no fighting," he bawled. "We decided to pull out of the valley and find some more peaceful place." "And now Jack's dead and your stock scattered," I raged, "just because you didn't want to fight. What the hell you ever cross the Pecos for if you didn't aim to fight nobody? Set the boys together in such stock as you got left." "But them Mexicans taken Betty!" he shrieked, tearing his scanty locks. "Most of 'em headed east, but 6 or 7 grabbed Betty right out of the wagon and rode off south with her, driving the hosses they stole from us." "Well, get your weapons and follow me," I roared. "For Lord's sake, forget they is places where sheriffs and policemen protects you, and make up your minds to fight. I'm going after Betty." I headed south as hard as Captain Kidd could run. The reason I hadn't met them Mexicans as I rode back from the flat where I met Cousin Bearfield was because they swung round the north end of the ridge when they headed east. I hadn't gone far when I heard a sudden burst of firing off to the east and figured they'd hit the Illinois camp. But I reckoned Bearfield had got there ahead of 'em. Still, it didn't seem like the shooting was far enough off to be at the other camp. But I didn't have no time to study it. Them gal thieves had a big start, but it didn't do no good. I hadn't rode over 3 miles till I heard the stolen hosses running ahead of me, and in a minute I bust out into an open flat and seen 6 Mexicans driving them critters at full speed, and one of 'em was holding Betty onto the saddle in front of him. It was that blasted Gomez. I come swooping down onto him with a 6-shooter in my right hand and a bowie knife in my left. Captain Kidd needed no guiding. He'd smelt blood and fire, and he come like a hurricane on Judgment Day, with his mane flying and his hoofs burning the grass. The Mexicans seen I'd ride 'em down before they could get across the flat, and they turned to meet me, shooting as they come. But Mexicans always was rotten shots. As we come together, I let bam 3 times with my .45 and "Three," says I. One of 'em rode at me from the side and clubbed his rifle and hit at my head, but I ducked and made one swipe with my bowie.